The $1 bolt sat in the palm of Elijah Coleman's hand when Chief Executive Officer Vivian Ashford announced in front of the entire assembly floor that he had stalled a defense program worth $1.2 billion over a piece of hardware cheaper than breakfast. She tore the red warning tag from the airframe, fired the single father on the spot, and ordered the crew to keep building. Elijah did not argue. He sealed the bolt inside an evidence bag, logged the time and his signature, and walked out through the gate he had entered for 9 years. 3 days later, that same bolt snapped inside a vibration chamber. By the end of the week, the billion-dollar contract that had defined Vivian Ashford's career was frozen, and nobody inside Ashford Defense Systems could explain why to the people who mattered most. Before that $1 bolt brings down a billion-dollar empire, tap subscribe now so you do not miss a single second of this breathtaking reversal unfolding right in front of you. Ashford Defense Systems had spent 4 generations building a reputation in the dry Texas plains for reconnaissance aircraft and military communication systems. And this particular week was supposed to be its crowning achievement. The company had won a conditional contract worth $1.2 billion to manufacture 180 A-47 Sentinel reconnaissance drones for the United States military, and everything hinged on a single prototype passing its final battery of tests. Army liaison board members and select members of the press had been flown in to witness the 36-hour vibration endurance run that would decide whether mass production could begin. The prototype also needed to survive extreme temperature cycling, a structural load inspection on its control assembly, and a full supply chain audit confirming that every component meticulation. Vivian Ashford had staked her name on this moment, and she intended for nothing to interrupt it. Elijah Coleman had worked quality inspection at Ashford for 9 years, though few people on the floor knew that he had once been the reliability engineer who helped design the very airframe now sitting in the test bay. After his wife died, he had walked away from a management track to take a stable, predictable shift that let him raise his daughter alone. And when he returned to the company at a lower title, the new leadership only ever saw the uniform, never the history behind it. He was a black man in a plain gray jumpsuit, easy for people in expensive suits to look past, and he never mentioned what he used to be. He never asked for shortcuts because of it. His only rule, the one he repeated to himself on every inspection, was that a part does not become safe simply because someone with a bigger title decided to use it anyway. During his final pass before the vibration test, Elijah noticed something wrong with a bolt seated in the tail actuator bracket. It lacked the manufacturer stamp required for approved aerospace hardware, and its coating had a faint sheen that did not match the matte finish of the certified part. He pulled it and cross-referenced the batch number against the supplier database, and the number did not exist anywhere in the system. In the storage room, he found a half-empty box with the same finish, and the label on that box told him everything he needed to know. A commercial-grade bolt, the kind sold at any hardware counter for about $1, while the certified aerospace equivalent cost roughly $43. Elijah placed a red tag on the airframe and halted the test. His shift supervisor warned him that a delay now could cost the entire team its quarterly bonus. Elijah still refused to sign off. He told the supervisor that a bolt did not need to fail today to be dangerous. It only needed to fail once at the worst possible moment, thousands of feet in the air. When he checked the purchase records further, he discovered the same commercial hardware had been quietly flowing into the production stock for 3 months, and he had no idea yet how many airframes it had already reached. Elijah had seen failures like this before, though never quite this brazen. Early in his career, back when he still carried the title of reliability engineer, he had chased down a batch of mislabeled rivets that nearly slipped past a different program entirely. And the memory of how close that near miss had come stayed with him every time he picked up a tool. Now he understood something that people who had never worked the floor rarely grasped. A defense aircraft did not fail because of one dramatic mistake. It failed because of 100 small compromises that everyone assumed someone else would catch. And this is where the real anatomy of the disaster begins to show itself, because the danger was never the bolt alone. The danger was a system where the person closest to the metal had the least authority, and the person furthest from it had the final word. A commercial bolt is easy to swap out. A culture that rewards speed and punishes the person who slows the line down to ask a question is far harder to replace, and it fails the same way every time. The commercial bolt in his hand was not evil or sabotage. It was simply cheaper, faster to source, and indistinguishable to an untrained eye, which made it more dangerous than an obvious defect ever could be. He photographed the batch stamp, logged the storage location of the box it came from, and cross-checked the delivery date against the missed shipment from the certified supplier before he ever brought the issue upstairs. Because he had learned long ago that a warning without documentation was just an opinion, and opinions were easy for people with more power to dismiss. Vivian Ashford walked onto the inspection floor within minutes of hearing that her flagship program had been halted. And the first thing she saw was a red tag hanging from the tail assembly of the aircraft that was supposed to secure her company's future. She wanted to know who exactly had decided that $1 billion defense contract should wait on a piece of metal that could be replaced from a bargain bin. Elijah laid out the difference between the commercial bolt and the certified part, as calmly as he had explained it 100 times before describing the alloy, the fatigue tolerance the coating rated for extreme humidity and heat cycling, and the traceability that military hardware required by law. Vivian never opened the folder he offered her. She only asked how much the part in his hand had cost, and when he answered that it was roughly $1, she laughed in front of the assembled liaison and press. Garrett Holloway, the chief operating officer standing at her side, announced that Elijah was holding up hundreds of employees over a component available at any hardware store in the state. Vivian asked whether Elijah understood what every hour of delay cost the company in penalties and lost confidence. Elijah answered that a budget spreadsheet did not change the fatigue limit of a metal alloy, and that answer, delivered without heat or apology, struck her as a public humiliation in front of the exact people she had invited to witness a triumph. She called him an inspector playing at being an engineer. Garrett added almost casually that Elijah needed this job to support his daughter, as if that fact alone should have made him easier to control. Vivian demanded he signed the release authorizing the test to continue. He refused, and she tore the red tag from the airframe with her own hand and fired him where he stood. A few of the younger technicians standing nearby exchanged glances, but said nothing, unwilling to risk their own positions over a disagreement that clearly did not involve them. One older machinist, who had worked alongside Elijah for years, quietly looked away, ashamed of his own silence, but unwilling to challenge the chief executive in front of visiting military liaison. Vivian seemed almost energized by the confrontation, as though proving her authority in front of an audience mattered more than the substance of what Elijah had actually found. She reminded the room that Ashford had built aircraft for 4 generations without needing a warehouse inspector to lecture the board on material science. And a few scattered laughs followed her remark, though they were thinner and more nervous than she seemed to notice. His badge was deactivated in front of the entire floor before he had even reached the door. Another inspector was ordered to sign in his place. Elijah did not beg to keep the job, and he did not raise his voice. He asked only that the company record formally that its chief executive had personally overruled a documented material safety warning. Garrett refused to provide anything in writing. Before he left, Elijah sealed the removed bolt inside a chain of custody evidence bag marked with his signature and the exact time of inspection, and he filed a report through the contract oversight channel reserved for safety concerns rather than internal grievances. Within minutes of his badge going dark, that same report was quietly downgraded inside the company's internal system from a critical safety flag to a minor documentation discrepancy. As Elijah walked out through the gate for the last time as an employee, Garrett gave a quiet order to replace the flagged bolt with another one pulled from the exact same box of commercial hardware and to bring the vibration test back online before the visiting liaison noticed anything had gone wrong. The prototype returned to the test chamber on schedule, and almost immediately Trevor Nolan, who ran the vibration lab, noticed that the batch number written on the tracking sheet had been changed in handwriting that did not match any of the standard entry forms. When he asked about it, Garrett told him plainly that Vivian had already approved everything and that further questions were not welcome. Across town, Elijah sat in his small apartment trying to figure out how he would explain to his daughter Simone that he had lost his job that morning over something that cost less than a cup of coffee. She called him during a break between classes, and he told her only that there had been a disagreement about a technical issue at work. Simone, 19, and a year into her mechanical engineering coursework, reminded him of something he had taught her years earlier, that a measurement does not change simply because someone in charge dislikes the result. She asked whether he needed her to come home for the weekend, and Elijah told her no, that he would be fine. And if I am being honest here, this is the part of the story I keep coming back to, because it would have been so easy for him to sign the paper, keep the paycheck, and tell himself that someone above his pay grade would deal with it. Most of us on our hardest days quietly hope that the courage we admire in other people will never actually be required of us. Elijah's quiet in that kitchen was not weakness. It was a man deciding what kind of father his daughter deserved before anyone was watching to reward him for it. Though the truth was, he had spent the last hour sitting at the kitchen table with a folder of termination paperwork. He had no intention of signing without a fight over the record itself. He thought about the years he had spent quietly building the very standards that were now being ignored, and how strange it felt to be treated as replaceable by people who had never once asked why the tail assembly on the A-47 had survived every prior stress test without incident. It was not pride that kept him awake that night, but a plain, stubborn certainty that somewhere on that production line, a part was going to fail exactly the way the data said it would. And no title in the company was going to change that outcome. Simone's voice on the phone stayed steady, even as she sensed something heavier beneath her father's calm tone. And before hanging up, she told him half joking and half serious that he had never once in her life been wrong about a measurement, and she did not expect that streak to end. Now Elijah checked the automated copy of the inspection report that had been routed to his personal certification email before his access was revoked, and he found that the timestamp, the severity rating, and the name of the approving authority had all been quietly altered. If there is one small thing worth carrying out of everything that happened that first day, it is this. The people we are quickest to overlook are often the ones paying closest attention, and it costs us almost nothing to listen to a person before we measure the size of their title. Inside the plant, Dr. Rachel Kessler, the lead engineer on the A-47 program, knew that continuing the test was wrong, but she had not yet found the courage to say so directly to Vivian. Vivian told her plainly that if the program failed because of an unnecessary delay, she would replace the entire engineering team without hesitation. Rachel, unsettled, pulled the original design file that night and confirmed what she already feared. The tail actuator bracket had always required a nickel alloy aerospace bolt, individually certified by batch, and the engineer who had written that exact specification years earlier was Elijah Coleman. Rachel realized with a mixture of guilt and disbelief that Vivian had just fired the very person who built the safety standard the company was now violating. Deep into the 12th hour of the restarted test, Trevor heard a faint metallic tick that the sensors had not yet flagged as a fault. Garrett insisted the run continue since stopping the chamber now would reset the certification clock back to 0 and threaten the entire visiting schedule. A high-speed camera recording the actuator assembly quietly captured the beginning of a hairline crack forming at the head of the replacement bolt, invisible to anyone watching with the naked eye. The visiting liaison had already left for the evening by the time the chamber reached its 19th hour, and only a skeleton crew remained on the floor to monitor the readouts through the night shift. Trevor sat alone at the control station, watching the vibration frequency hold steady on the display, unaware that the faint metallic tick he had heard hours earlier had already progressed into a crack running nearly halfway through the bolt's cross-section. At the 19th hour of testing, the bolt sheared clean through. The actuator bracket shifted out of its calibrated position, and the tail assembly drifted 0.7 degrees off axis before the chamber's automatic safety system shut the whole run down. No one was harmed, since the prototype sat fully enclosed inside a controlled test environment built for exactly this kind of failure. But the deviation was more than enough to disqualify the aircraft from certification. Trevor sealed the failed bolt in an evidence container and backed up every second of camera footage before anyone could ask him not to. Garrett arrived at the test bay within minutes and pushed hard for the incident to be logged as a rig malfunction rather than a component failure, proposing that they quietly swap the part and restart the clock without informing the customer at all. Vivian agreed almost immediately, since the Defense Oversight audit team was scheduled to arrive in only 2 days. Rachel objected, pointing out that the fracture pattern on the bolt clearly indicated metal fatigue, not equipment error. Vivian reminded her that Elijah had made the same argument days earlier and had been fired for it. Trevor quietly reached out to Elijah and sent him photographs of the fracture surface before anyone could stop him. Elijah recognized the failure pattern immediately, a crack that had originated in the threaded load-bearing section exactly as he predicted. He told Trevor not to move the failed part from its sealed bag and not to sign anything that had already been altered. While the leadership team scrambled to restart the chamber quietly, the Contract Oversight Office received Elijah's earlier external report, and Diane Foster, the lead auditor for the Defense Contract Oversight Agency, ordered Ashford to halt all testing activity immediately until her team could inspect the site in person. Vivian assumed she could paint Elijah as a disgruntled former employee attempting to sabotage the company on his way out, and her communication staff quietly prepared talking points, describing him as someone terminated for insubordination. Diane made it clear on the phone that her audit would not stop at a single broken bolt. It would examine the entire supply chain feeding the A-47 program from the ground up. Diane arrived at Ashford Defense Systems with an independent audit team the following morning, and Vivian staged an elaborate welcome designed to project total control over the situation, describing the fractured bolt as an isolated packaging error from an outside supplier. Diane asked to see the failed bolt, the original purchase order, and the very first inspection report filed on the incident, and the 3 documents contained 3 different batch numbers. Trevor handed over the original high-speed footage, which showed unmistakably that the crack had developed gradually throughout the vibration run, rather than appearing suddenly from equipment failure. Vivian tried once more to redirect blame toward Elijah, arguing that he had removed the original part without authorization before anyone else could examine it. Diane responded by inviting Elijah back onto the plant floor to walk her team through the inspection process, and he crossed through the very same doors from which security had escorted him days earlier. Vivian seated him at the far end of the conference table and introduced him to the room as a former employee recently terminated from the company, hoping to frame his presence as irrelevant. Elijah did not argue about his title or his dignity. He simply placed the $1 commercial bolt beside a certified aerospace equivalent on the table, and the 2 pieces looked nearly identical in size and shape. He explained, without raising his voice, exactly where they differed: the alloy composition, the heat treatment, the protective coating, the fatigue tolerance rating, and the traceability records that only the certified part carried. Diane ordered a random inspection of the storage warehouse, and within hours, her team found thousands of commercial-grade bolts mixed directly into bins of certified hardware. Many of them relabeled with new tags that did not match their true origin. Dalton Pierce, the supply chain director, insisted this had been the unauthorized action of a single warehouse employee acting alone. But the purchasing records told a different story, showing his own signature on the original order placed with the discount industrial supplier. Vivian still maintained that no one in leadership had known these substitutions were happening. Then Diane opened the original design specification file and asked in front of the entire room who had written the original certification standard for that bolt assembly. It was Rachel who answered first, her voice steady despite the tension in the room. Elijah Coleman. Every person in that conference room who had once dismissed the quiet inspector in the plain uniform now understood that they had fired the very engineer who built the safety standard they had just violated. And the silence that followed said more than any accusation could have. A junior auditor on Diane's team quietly pulled up 9-year-old archived files while the room was still absorbing what Rachel had said. And there, buried in a folder few people had opened in years, sat the original prototype failure report bearing Elijah's signature and a nearly identical description of a fatigued, driven bracket failure. The parallel was almost eerie, as though the company had simply forgotten the lesson it had already paid to learn. Once before, Vivian tried to recover her composure by suggesting that historical documents had little bearing on a current supply chain issue, but Edmund, listening closely from the far end of the table, had already begun taking notes of his own. The kind of notes that suggested his loyalty to Vivian was starting to erode in real time. Elijah was asked to help the audit team inspect every airframe currently in production, and he agreed without asking for reinstatement or any acknowledgement of what had happened to him personally. As the inspection widened, the team discovered commercial-grade bolts installed at multiple vibration critical points across the production line, not just the tail actuator assembly that had first drawn attention. In total, roughly 6,400 uncertified fasteners were found across the warehouse stock and on 64 separate airframes already in various stages of assembly. Not every bolt was guaranteed to fail, but without traceable material data, not a single one could be certified as safe either. Diane issued an order halting the entire A-47 program, and the Defense Department froze the first scheduled payment on the contract. Ashford's stock price dropped sharply within hours as the news spread through investors and defense analysts alike. Vivian continued to insist publicly that the fault lay entirely with an unreported supply chain failure she had never been told about. News of the shutdown moved quickly through the plant, and the mood on the production floor shifted from confusion to quiet anger. As workers realized how close they had come to shipping compromised hardware without ever knowing it, many of them had trusted the inspection stamps on every box that came through receiving, never imagining that the stamps themselves could be part of the problem. A few veteran assemblers who had worked with Elijah for years began quietly telling newer hires what they remembered about him. That he had a reputation long before his return to the company for being the kind of engineer who never let a shortcut slide, no matter how small. That reputation, buried for years under a lower title and a quiet demeanor, began resurfacing in breakroom conversations across every shift. Elijah pointed the audit team toward a single line buried in a purchase requisition. A handwritten note approving the use of an equivalent commercial part in order to protect the delivery schedule. The first signature on that approval belonged to Garrett Holloway. Beneath his signature sat Vivian's own electronic approval. She argued that her signature had only authorized a budget adjustment, not a change to technical specifications. But Diane's team then surfaced an email in which Rachel had explicitly warned that the substitution had never undergone fatigue load evaluation. Vivian's reply to that warning, preserved in the company's own servers, stated that Ashford could not afford to sacrifice a $1.2 billion contract over what she called differences that existed only on paper. Garrett attempted to shift blame onto Rachel for failing to block the substitution more forcefully, and Rachel, to her credit, admitted openly that she had stayed silent out of fear for her position. A confession that visibly unsettled several board members who had assumed the engineering team operated with far more independence than it actually did. She handed Diane an older document proving that Elijah had identified an almost identical failure mode during the original prototype phase 9 years earlier, and that his standards, quietly written and quietly enforced, were the very reason the A-47 had ever passed certification the first time. Vivian had spent years promoting the aircraft's legendary reliability without ever knowing whose work that reputation had actually been built on. The hardest silence to break is usually not the one in front of strangers, but the one in front of the boss who can end your career. Rachel's confession is a reminder that speaking up late is still worth more than never speaking at all, and that most of us are only ever one honest sentence away from becoming part of the solution instead of part of the cover. Edmund Sterling, the longtime chairman of the board, convened an emergency session, and Vivian asked Elijah to appear and reassure the board that the situation could still be resolved quickly. Elijah agreed to attend, but he refused to promise any outcome in advance. On his way out of the plant that evening, several of the technicians who had once watched him get walked to the gate now nodded to him in the hallway, a small gesture that carried more weight than any formal apology could have. He did not linger to accept it. He simply nodded back and kept walking, aware that whatever came next would be decided in a boardroom, not a hallway, and that recognition from co-workers, however welcome, changed nothing about the work still ahead of him. Before the hearing began, Garrett approached Elijah privately in a conference room with no camera running, offering him reinstatement, a substantial raise, and a newly created position as Director of Quality, on the sole condition that he described the broken bolt publicly as an isolated shipment error with no bearing on overall aircraft safety. Elijah asked what would happen to the thousands of remaining uncertified parts still installed throughout the fleet. Garrett admitted the company planned to quietly replace them after the contract had already been signed and payment secured. Elijah refused the offer outright, telling Garrett plainly that a title with his name on it meant nothing if it required him to sign his name to a lie. Garrett pressed further, suggesting that no one outside the room would ever know the real reason behind his change of heart, and that the company could quietly make the remaining replacements over the following months without anyone the wiser. Elijah reminded him that quiet replacement was exactly the plan that had already led to a fractured actuator bracket and a halted federal contract, and that repeating the same mistake more carefully was still the same mistake. Vivian entered the room moments later and tried her own version of persuasion, warning that if the contract collapsed entirely, thousands of innocent workers would lose their jobs through no fault of their own. Elijah answered that leadership itself had placed those workers in danger the moment it chose to hide a known risk rather than fix it. Vivian then invoked his circumstances as a single father, suggesting he should think of his daughter's future before making a decision that could end his career for good. Elijah told her that his daughter needed an unemployed father who told the truth far more than she needed one who had been paid to certify a lie. Vivian's patience broke, and she threatened legal action for disclosure of proprietary company information. Elijah reminded her calmly that he had only ever submitted his findings to the oversight authority legally empowered to receive them. The entire exchange had been logged on Garrett's own office calendar, and Diane already knew Elijah had been approached. Afterward, Diane asked him directly what he actually wanted out of the process. His answer contained 3 requests: a full inspection of every uncertified component still in the system, protection for any employee who had reported concerns honestly, and public disclosure of the true approval chain instead of quietly blaming a single warehouse worker. He asked for no money and no title. Edmund began to understand, watching this exchange unfold, that the quiet inspector in front of him carried more credibility than the entire executive team combined. During the board hearing itself, Vivian continued describing Elijah as someone acting out of personal grievance, until Diane requested that the security footage from the day of his termination be played for the room. Every board member heard in Vivian's own voice the line about a piece of metal cheaper than breakfast. Diane announced that the true crisis was no longer a single fractured bolt, but evidence that Ashford Defense Systems had knowingly submitted falsified certification to the federal government, an offense with consequences far beyond one failed component. A formal hearing was convened with representatives from the Defense Department, full board membership, and outside contract counsel present. Vivian arrived flanked by an entire legal team, dressed as sharply as she had been the day she announced the contract to the press. Though the confidence in her posture no longer matched the mood of the room, Elijah brought only a single folder, the $1 commercial bolt, and its certified counterpart, setting both down on the table without ceremony, the same way he had done in every inspection report he had ever filed. Vivian argued that no aircraft had actually crashed and that the failure had occurred only under deliberately extreme laboratory conditions. Elijah explained patiently that the entire purpose of extreme testing was to expose exactly the kind of failure that would otherwise appear later in the field after thousands of flight cycles. He never claimed that every substituted bolt was guaranteed to fail, only that no one in the company could produce a single shred of data proving any of them were safe. Diane laid out the full timeline for the room without embellishment. The certified supplier had missed a delivery deadline. Garrett had proposed a commercial substitute to avoid stopping the line. Rachel had sent a documented warning about untested fatigue performance. Vivian had approved continued production anyway. Elijah had discovered the substitution and been fired for refusing to authorize it. His report had been quietly altered within minutes of his termination. The bolt failed exactly as predicted during formal testing. Management had then attempted to disguise the failure as equipment error rather than material failure. Trevor confirmed under questioning that he had been directly instructed to delete the high-speed camera footage that ultimately proved the fatigue crack had formed gradually. Dalton admitted that he had relabeled boxes of commercial hardware at Garrett's explicit direction. Garrett, cornered, attempted to shift full responsibility onto Vivian, insisting she had known everything from the beginning. Vivian turned immediately and tried to place the blame back onto Garrett alone. Edmund asked her plainly why she had fired Elijah on the spot if she genuinely had not understood the severity of what he was reporting. Vivian had no answer that did not amount to an admission that she had seen the warning clearly and chosen to ignore it anyway. Several board members who had said little throughout the hearing began exchanging quiet glances, clearly recalculating their own positions now that the paper trail left no room for ambiguity about who had known what and when. A representative from the Defense Department reminded the room that the contract required the integrity of the entire quality management system, not merely a single working prototype. Falsified documentation invalidated every certification the company had submitted up to that point, regardless of how many individual parts might still perform correctly. Ashford was given one final opportunity to demonstrate that the failure was isolated to this single program. Instead, the expanded inspection uncovered 2 additional defense projects where uncertified substitute components had quietly slipped through approval without proper review. Each one tracing back to the same discount supplier Dalton had first contacted months earlier in an effort to protect delivery deadlines. The pattern made it impossible for Vivian to continue framing the situation as an isolated mistake confined to a single aircraft, and even her own legal counsel began advising her privately to stop making public statements that contradicted the growing paper trail. The Defense Department announced it would deliver a final ruling on the fate of the contract the following morning, and no one inside Ashford Defense Systems slept easily that night. Reporters gathered outside the plant gates by early evening, and for the first time in the company's long history, its name appeared in national headlines for reasons that had nothing to do with innovation or achievement. The following morning, the board's senior staff and government representatives gathered inside Ashford's headquarters for the final decision. Vivian still believed her company was simply too large and too essential to the program to be removed entirely, and she prepared remarks describing the situation as a temporary delay rather than a termination. Diane read the official ruling aloud without any softening of its language. The $1.2 billion A-47 contract was terminated effective immediately. Ashford Defense Systems was disqualified from participating in the rebid process. Every quality certification tied to the program would require full independent review before any future eligibility could be considered. All falsified documentation uncovered during the investigation would be forwarded to federal contract fraud investigators for further action. The decision rested not solely on one uncertified bolt, but on the total collapse of trust in the systems meant to guarantee safety in the first place. Vivian lost the contract she had once called the defining achievement of her career, and the company's valuation dropped sharply within hours as several partners quietly suspended ongoing negotiations. Analysts who had once praised her aggressive growth strategy now questioned publicly whether her leadership style had prioritized speed over the basic integrity that defense contracting demanded. Employees watching the news from the plant floor felt the weight of the moment differently than the executives in the boardroom. Many of them worried less about headlines and more about whether their own jobs would still exist by the end of the month. Edmund demanded her immediate resignation as chief executive. She attempted to push back, but by then Garrett had already surrendered his email archive to investigators in an effort to reduce his own exposure, and the board voted almost unanimously to suspend Vivian effective that same afternoon. Garrett and Dalton were terminated outright, and within days both men had retained separate legal counsel as federal investigators began reviewing the falsified purchase records more closely. Rachel resigned voluntarily from her position as lead engineer, stating openly that her silence had made her complicit in something. She could no longer defend a statement she repeated almost word for word months later when speaking to a room of younger engineers about the cost of staying quiet. As the room began to empty, Vivian turned to Elijah and asked almost bitterly whether he felt satisfied now. Elijah answered that no one truly wins when thousands of innocent workers pay the price for decisions made by only a handful of people at the top. He picked up the $1 bolt from the table and said quietly enough that only those nearby could hear that the company had not lost $1.2 billion because of that small piece of metal. It had lost everything because the people holding power believed a single dollar was too small a thing to be worth listening to. There was no applause, no dramatic celebration in the room, only a heavy silence that spoke louder than any speech could have made heavier still by the fact that Elijah showed no interest in savoring Vivian's downfall. In the days that followed, the board offered Elijah the newly created position of Vice President of Quality, and he did not answer immediately. He eventually declined the title, explaining that simply replacing one person with unchecked power with another person holding the same unchecked power would solve nothing in the long run. Instead, he agreed to build an independent safety division reporting directly to the board rather than to any single executive. That division was given the authority to halt production on its own judgment, to report concerns directly to government customers without executive filtering to protect employees from retaliation for raising honest concerns, and to publicly disclose any significant material substitution before it ever reached a customer. Ashford lost the A-47 program permanently, but the company was allowed to continue its civilian aviation contracts once the full restructuring had been completed and independently verified. At its own expense, the company recalled and replaced every one of the 6,400 uncertified fasteners discovered throughout its production stock. And because the failure had been caught during controlled laboratory testing rather than in the field, not a single aircraft was ever lost, and not a single life was ever put at risk. The recall took months and cost the company a substantial sum. But Edmund later told shareholders that the price of doing it properly was still smaller than the price of doing it wrong a second time. Slowly, cautiously, other government agencies that had paused their dealings with Ashford began reviewing the company's new safety framework, and a handful signaled a willingness to reconsider future contracts once the restructuring proved durable rather than cosmetic. 6 months later, Elijah walked back through the same gate where he had once been escorted out. Though this time he still wore the same plain work uniform rather than an executive suit. Having chosen a hands-on role over an office with a view, Simone came to the opening of the new material inspection lab, named in honor of the standards her father had quietly written years before anyone thought to thank him for them. And though she only appeared for a brief moment at the ceremony, The quiet pride on her face as she read his name on the restored certification protocol said everything that needed to be said. Trevor had been promoted to head the newly independent test division. Rachel returned in an advisory capacity from outside the company, publicly accepting responsibility for the silence that had once cost so much. Vivian appeared one final time at a shareholder meeting, admitting openly that she had dismissed Elijah because of his title and his circumstances rather than the substance of what he actually said. She was never reinstated, but the admission suggested at least that she finally understood where the failure had truly begun. Some shareholders in the room found little comfort in the apology, having watched her defend the opposite position for weeks before the evidence became impossible to ignore. But a few of the older board members, including Edmund, noted quietly afterward that an honest reckoning, however late, was still worth more than none at all. Visitors touring the rebuilt facility often remarked on how ordinary everything looked. No dramatic banners, no framed headlines about the scandal, just a working plant full of people doing their jobs a little more carefully than they used to. On the new production floor, a young inspector noticed a washer with a slightly different sheen than the approved standard called for. Instead of being mocked or waved through the way Elijah once had been, the entire section stopped work immediately without argument. Elijah walked over unhurried, as always, examined the part personally under a magnifying lamp, checked it against the reference sheet twice, and confirmed it fell within an approved tolerance variation rather than posing any actual risk. The line restarted within the hour once the paperwork had been properly verified, and not a single person on that floor complained about the time it had cost them, since every one of them had learned by now exactly what a small, overlooked detail could eventually become if nobody bothered to stop and check. New hires touring the facility often stopped in front of that glass case without knowing the full story behind it, and the trainers leading them through orientation had taken to telling the short version before moving on to the technical curriculum, treating it less like company history and more like a rule everyone was expected to carry forward. Elijah never asked for the case to be installed, and he never gave interviews about what had happened to him, preferring instead to spend his days walking the same production floor he always had, checking the same kinds of parts he checked for years before anyone knew his name. He kept a copy of the old altered inspection report in a drawer at home, not out of bitterness, but as a reminder of how easily the truth could be quietly rewritten if no one was paying close enough attention. Simone sometimes asked him whether he regretted refusing Garrett's offer that day in the empty conference room, and he always gave her the same answer, that the version of himself who signed that paper would have been someone she could never fully trust again, and that was a price no raise could ever cover. Elijah placed the original $1 bolt inside a small glass case in the training center, and beneath it, he had a simple line engraved into a brass plate. The price of a single part may only be $1, but the price of ignoring the person who noticed it can be an entire empire, and maybe that is the quiet thing worth taking home from all of this. The truth you protect when it costs you something is the same truth your children will one day learn to trust, and integrity, it turns out, is rarely loud. It usually looks like an ordinary person in an ordinary uniform refusing to sign their name to something they know is not right.